Thank you. So now, in order to ensure that we'll have the next presentation completed, I would like to switch to the next, on the last actually, presentation of this morning session. It will be a shared presentation by Gerardo Durand and Francisco-INEGI on measuring Mexico's manufacturing exports, micro and macro perspectives. So before giving the floor to them, I will briefly introduce these two colleagues. So first of all, about Gerardo Durand is an economist and holds the office of Deputy Director General of Economic Surveys and Administration Records at INEGI. He has been an economist, professor at Metropolitan Autonomous University and researcher in the Research and Teaching Economics Center in Mexico. He has worked in a number of papers related to industrial organization, and he's authored for the book of Strategies of the Firms in Mexico, the Case of Petrochemical and Machine Tool Industries. So he also represents INEGI and Mexico, of course, in different international groups, working parties at the OECD, UNSD, UNSC, and Latin American Association for Integration. And since 2003, he coordinates the Mexican delegation in the North American Transportation Statistics interchange with the US and Canada. Regarding Francisco-INEGI, so he also has a bachelor degree on economics, and he also has several studies on national accounts and input-output tables. He has been working in INEGI and in the statistical fields for quite a number of years, about 30. And he has occupied different positions within INEGI. I will not go into details of all of them, but simply to say that now he holds the office of Deputy Director General of National Accounts. So then I think I will give the floor first, I think it's to Gerardo, and then the presentation will continue with the intervention of Francisco. So you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Luis, and especially thank you to the UNSD for the opportunity to give this presentation. Now, taking advantage of INEGI's hosting this meeting and the mother language in Mexico is Spanish, we will talk in Spanish so you can take your devices in order to facilitate the comprehension of this presentation in Spanish. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much to everyone. Well, we're going to talk about under two perspectives of what we've been doing at INEGI with regards to measurement of our manufactured exports. In the previous presentation by Luis de la Fuente, we are doing this under a micro perspective provided by a study to provide statistics on exports and imports of goods, making a distinction in the characteristics of manufacturing enterprises that are participating in this international trade. And this for the purpose of providing more elements for analysis to economic policymakers on the external sector. So we set out to accomplish some particular goals, the first of which was for us to have a statistical infrastructure in our country that is more solid, a stronger one, with a more detailed vision of the manufacturing activities, in this case having to do with the foreign sector, provide information on how much companies tend to export or import, how much they relate to the foreign sector, and under this case, under the new configuration of globalization and value chains, how much do these companies have to do with this phenomenon occurring worldwide. Assess also the effects of international merchandise trade on our own and domestic production and the employments generated by it. Of course, we are highly interested in providing information to policymakers. In this case, there is a basic user in the country, which is the Ministry of the Economy, so that they can have more tools in order to establish public policy. And something that this statistical effort provided was, as we worked in our national accounts, in other words, this link between international merchandise trade and customs records with the manufacturing sources became the cornerstone to estimate new statistics which as I mentioned before, will be described by Francisco Guillén, and this has to do with the added value of exporting global manufacturers. This statistic is done under a methodological focus within the framework of national accounts, taking advantage of the supply and use frameworks that Francisco will explain. So the first thing we had to do in this case, in order to link the information of our customs records with what is provided by manufacturing surveys, was to consolidate and set up companies by virtue of the fact that the observation unit we have in economic census and in our manufacturing surveys are the establishments themselves, in other words, the industrial plant. So under this purpose, we consolidated enterprises in order to make this observation unit equitable with what we have in custom information, which includes enterprises. So this framework for confirmation allows us to have equitable observation units, and in this way link elements that are going to be associated elements and that are comparable. In the case of IMEX, the acronym means Maquila Manufacturing and Export Services Industry. IMEX is a program, it's a regulation by the Mexican government to promote export activity, economic flows, and job generation in our country. This program encompasses close to 6,400 economic units or establishments, which are important job generators and that come from what you used to know as export maquilas. This program to encourage the export maquila industry. Nowadays, this program envelopes maquila companies and another group of exporting companies that used to be known as those under a temporary import program for exports, known as PITEX companies, maquila companies that are encompassed and are highly related to the foreign sector because of their exporting vocation and because of this relationship they have to generate economic flows and employment and high levels of exports. So what we did is through the economic census, where we sweep through the national territory to collect the information every 5 years, in this case of the non-farming economic activities, gave us an idea of the group of plants and establishments that were a part of a company. And in this way, we were able to set up and consolidate the enterprises and create the comparison elements for the customs belt. In other words, the records of the foreign trade of merchandise. Importantly to note here is to make a distinction. Once we set up and consolidated these enterprises, we had to make a distinction between those related to foreign trades or focused towards the foreign sector. Hence, the blue arrow is the focus of our study to look for these outward-oriented enterprises and link them to the import-export data that our customs records have in our country. So these three criteria are the baseline or the basis for the segmentation was established in the blue arrow. And this is, first of all, that they need to sell products abroad. These consolidated enterprises need to sell products abroad. They should also purchase materials coming from abroad. In other words, they buy or sell with the foreign sector, and in any event, have some kind of program of IMEX, this promotion of the maquila manufacturing and export services industry. If they met at least one of these conditions, then we would be able to say that they were outward-oriented. In other words, through the encouragement program or because they purchased or sold abroad. Under this scenario, with the conceptual constraints I have already described, the companies that are outward-oriented represent 78%. They are very, very related to the outward sector, and only 22% have no outward ties. They are producing for the domestic economy. Their manufacturers are strictly focused on the internal market. When we look at the number of companies that we linked, talking about the consolidation of these plants and these enterprises created. When we look at the central figure, we have 7,193 companies that we linked, and behind them are approximately 14,000 industrial plants or establishments. Gary, in his presentation of global value chains, was speaking about establishments behind these companies. And behind these companies, we have identified behind these, when we look at these companies, there are 482 that export only, 1,129 that import only, and that carry out purchases and sales. And of those, we have 5,582. This is the group of the 7,193 enterprises described here. And this is an average of the years that we included in this statistical series from 2007 to 2012. And I will present the results later. Now, in terms of value, in the export-import amounts, let's say the total value of foreign trade of manufactured products, we have the following figures. The green bars are showing the percentage attained with respect to the total value of foreign trade of manufactured goods in the country. In other words, in the last year, I'm going to focus the analysis on this final bar to your right. We reached $616 billion in exports and imports, the aggregate of both, of manufactured goods. Now, what these 7,193 companies are explaining out of these $616.7 billion, they represent of that 84%. This, of course, bespeaks of the high concentration of foreign trade within a group of companies, which are these 7,193. And when we look at the other years included in the series, these are the coverage levels attained in the value of the total trade. Now let's look at the results. Now the results of this effort to link these data. What do we have? Well, this is one of the snapshots that we didn't used to have until we put forth this effort to link foreign trade records with what we have in our manufacturing surveys and economic census. First of all, we should like to highlight the green. These are economic units, enterprises that have more than 500 employees. This is on the right. 82%, they represent 82% of this total aggregate of imports and exports conducted by our country. And these are accomplished by these giant companies with more than 500 strong. Nevertheless, when we look at the companies to the left, they only represent 17%. Now here, the slice, the orange slice, represents the number of companies, and the most relevant that we are terming the medium strata from 50 to 250 employees. So what we're seeing is a composition of trade where we're making a distinction between the number of companies according to their size, considering the employees, number of employees, and on the other hand, the amount in the value of foreign trade they generate by adding imports and exports. Now, if we, in this case, under the focus of the size of the company according to the number of employees. In this case, we're looking at the value of their imports and exports on average according to the size of the company. So always, if we did a simple exercise, we would have a surplus of companies with more than 500 employees, $187 million throughout 2012. That is the average. These are the average exports of these giant companies in the country, and their imports amount to 157. So in $1 million, these are the different strata. The small ones that have up to 50 employees are exporting $1.4 million, and they're importing $2 million. And what we can appreciate here are other figures, but this is the average value of the company according to their size, considering the number of employees or headcount. Now, when we look at these companies that are focused to the exterior, the production they accomplish shows that these giant companies with more than 500 in man count are exporting 58% of their production. In other words, 58 out of every $100 produced by these giant companies are targeted for export, to sales to the foreign market. Now, the performance is more or less homogeneous in the sizes of companies in terms of small, medium, and large. Even companies with less than 500 employed, the levels there are between 41 and 42%. Now, this concentration of foreign trade, if we already mentioned that 84% of foreign trade on average in the period between 2007 and 2012 is concentrated in 7,193 companies, when we look at 2012, only in that year alone, almost 6,000 companies of 5,946 which are being considered in the study, well, these companies in the year 2012 represented 88%. I said in the average from 2007-2012, there was a different percentage. Now, here we can see that 5 companies concentrate 16%, and 24%. Imagine 100 companies explain half or account for the half of the value of manufactured good exports in Mexico, a high concentration of companies without a doubt. And of course, if we review the literature and proposals on GVCs and multinational companies, many of these, perhaps almost all of them, are multinational companies, and behind them we would evidently have interfirm trade. It turns out that 500 companies represent 72, 1,081, and as I said, all the companies in 2012 represent 88%. Now, when we look at the regions that these companies trade with, let's think about sales. And once again, in the parameter of the size of the economic unit. Once again, the macro segment is the most important one, shown in green for all regions. But here, it's also important to highlight that we can also see small, medium companies, companies with less than 500 employees. We can see their trade with North America, Latin America, the European Union, with Asia, and without a doubt this is important for policy purposes in order to have a clear notion of what are the destinations these companies direct their exports to and where there would be business opportunities. Now, this also talks about diversification in foreign trade. Let's talk about sales, once again, carried out by these companies. Now, on your far right, the column shows companies that have a single country as the destination of their exports, according to the destination country definition established by international guidelines. To the right, increase 2 countries, 3 to 5, and even though macro companies are the ones that are noteworthy with the greatest number of destination countries, here it's relevant to look at the segment running from 52 to 51 to 150. From 3 to 5 companies. And even though these companies are not very large, these are companies that can be classified as medium. They also have several destinations, and these represent business opportunities. Now, when we look towards industries, specific manufacturing activities, it's no surprise. Professor Gareffi already spoke about what industries are currently of interest, what are the ones that have been included in our National Development Plan and have been proposed as strategic. Well, the automotive industry with regards to transportation equipment in these large shares, hence the green, has the share of these activities is 41%. Those having to do with computer equipment and communication represent 27%, electrical appliances and accessories 6%, basic metals 5%, and other manufacturers or goods represent the remaining 21%. In other words, we have a high concentration, and it's important to underscore this as the initial conclusion of the study. There are very few companies. The automotive industry and the electronic industry and the electric industry are concentrated on very few companies. And all these goods is where our country has immersed itself in globalization. Now, regions and countries, United States is, of course, the main destination. They're our main partner within NAFTA. Canada, there's a huge difference in destination, jumping from 8 to 3%. And then we have other partners in Latin America, such as Brazil and Colombia, and the rest of Latin American countries, which make up 13%. Now, we should not lose sight of the fact that we're focusing on giant companies with more than 500 man count, which are the ones that I focused this part of the study on for time constraints. This part, if I may, to conclude and give the floor to my colleague Francisco Guillén, who will explain the next section of this presentation. What Hubert mentioned a moment ago from the World Trade Organization about the fact that statistical and geographical information, of course, in our own institution, it makes it a very special institution, as Dr. Eduardo Sojo mentioned in his opening remarks yesterday. This possibility, of course, has provided us this idea of georeferencing information and taking advantage of the locations of the economic units. Under this new study, we generated a byproduct that allowed us to embark upon a new statistic that we didn't have before in our country, and that is export by state of the country. Mexico includes 32 states. So what we were able to do by locating the plants and by forming the enterprises and identifying the amounts of export, what we did was to georeference and physically locate these industrial plants that are producing for export in order to determine how much they are exporting within the states, what each state is exporting in order to make appropriate estimates. So that is the focus that we worked for this micro perspective, and our goals were for this to be a cornerstone to estimate value added of global manufacturing that my colleague Francisco Guillén will be discussing next. Thank you, Gerardo. So to continue with Spanish, so that you do not remove your headsets, it is my task to tell you a little bit about the macro perspective of the measurements of what we have termed added value of global manufacturing exports. The first thing that I need to point out is, and here I would like to mention that a framework such as our national accounts system, the one in 2008 that we have already applied to Mexican national accounts, just as the previous ones, give us all the assessment tools for concepts and definitions and elements that can be articulated. And together with this, we also applied, in the case of Mexico, the United States, or Canada, we have been using the ISIC for North America. So in this case, we conducted a detailed study of everything we could consider with regards imports and exports under the harmonized system in order to classify each one of these elements and complement the information that came from all this characterization process observed through economic census surveys. So this gave us a very clear vision that also provided the opportunity to use supply and use tables. In order to discuss some of the elements, as you might recall, that what we were looking for was to associate or understand what global manufacturing elements, in other words, not just total exports, but related parts that are associated in fragmented global production chains. So one of the underlying elements of our criteria is that by reviewing our economic census, we were able to look at the concept of foreign share of capital that could be extracted from the census data and then look at it with time in every one of the companies and firms detected through manufacturing surveys. We know that inasmuch as foreign capital participation is 50+1, company control, the flows that can be generated by other elements such as R&D and the production modes are determined by foreign companies. We also considered enterprises, the inputs of which, even though of foreign origin, their production is earmarked mainly for export. So this means they function under an international framework for production. And there's an additional criterion that was included that in the event that the two previous ones are not considered, then this means that if we're talking about intermediate goods exporting companies, these, of course, intermediate goods will undergo an additional process elsewhere. Expressed differently, we're looking at Mexico with regards to the rest of the world. We're seeing how much we send to Canada, how much comes from Japan, etc., and so on. And this gave us an important reconciliation aspect on our results in national accounts. And a basic aspect of this, well, we had to deal with concepts that had to do with global manufacturing production, which is nothing more than the production of all the goods and services generated by a given industry, including not only imported inputs, but also domestic inputs and the gross added value. On the other hand, in terms of gross added value of global manufactured products, they are a part of the global manufacturing, and this allowed us to extract out of the production value of these global manufacturing goods the intermediate consumption of imported origin, and this has to do whether it was a property or not of the establishment. So once we were able to eliminate this or segregate this, this allowed us to avoid double counting, to reach the concept of the added value of the global manufacturing associated to global value chains. Expressed differently, here we were able, with all these elements and the criteria, we were able to link not only trade of manufactured goods. In other words, we were able to observe the difference between imports and exports of these kinds of industries on a one-on-one basis. And on the other hand, we were able to link the added value of the export of these global manufactured goods. And to these, we included intermediate goods with domestic inputs, which were exactly the same as the added value of the exports of global manufacturers. So this closed our trade balance with respect to production levels of the manufacturing industries. A few results. Well, here we can say that on average for the period from 2003 to 2012, within the manufactured goods exports, approximately 70% of these global manufacturings are represented in the foreign trade in our exports, total exports. On the other hand, within total manufacturing sectors, in general terms, a third is occupied by added value. Now, by sector, this is just a segmentation of some of the main sectors. This can be, we can drill down to 86 economic activities according to the North American industrial classification system. But what we can observe here is that during this period, if we look at the yellow bars, that refers to motor vehicle production, the share has been increased in terms of value added significantly. The same thing with motor vehicle parts that run from 13.2 to 18%. And we can see the yellow sector showing electronic components and semiconductors. And this is where we can observe a slight decline, but as a group, if we look at the rest of manufacturing activities as a group, we can see that there is a loss in terms of share as added value to exports of global manufactured goods. 45.1%, it dropped to 38.5% in the total amount of this added value. On the other hand, here we can clearly observe a specific sector, and here the average in terms of added value in the export of global manufacturers shown in goods, shown in yellow, represented for this period 66.6%. And intermediate consumption of domestic origin is 38.5%. In other words, the national component on the input side is also significantly high. You might ask me, well, what happened in the year 2010? Well, we should recall that in Mexico, we had a very important decline. Our crisis occurred in 2009, and in the case of the automotive industry, we had a rebound effect in the year 2010. That's why we can observe this performance. On the other hand, we're not only looking at these elements under for the automotive sector, but also for the rest of the economic activities. This is another example. Here we have a greater variability, which is basically due, this is referred to the electronic component sector. The average is 29.8% as part of the export added value of global manufacturing goods, and consumption of domestic consumption is at around 21.9%. So this allows us to look at domestic origin inputs imported by economic activity with a drill down to the type of good for intermediate consumption. And we can also link these industries of the job positions and the average contribution of global manufacturing goods, and we relate it to jobs is close to 22.8%. 1,133,000 on workers on average that are linked to these global manufacturing goods. Well, this is published as part of our GDP and national accounts on our webpage at the Institute, and in particular, there's an item called added value for exports in global manufacturing, and the next steps mostly have to do with linking our records with our future economic census and economic surveys in order to observe sectors and their activities with a greater degree of detail, and also analyze value chains with the ones existing in other countries. We already mentioned some work that lies ahead of us, and we're also going to take advantage of the fact that future economic census that are referred to data from 2013 and that have been carried out during this year included a series of questions that will allow us to know with greater detail some of the links that firms have in order to have a fuller list and map as to how industries operate in the foreign market. For our part, this is all. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias a los dos I will switch now to English. So, despite the fact that my mother tongue is Spanish, but anyway, I think I will switch to English. So, I think that both presentations, or the shared presentation, has been also quite comprehensive. The results shown are also very interesting. Particularly the first presentation from Gerardo Duran was something that is linked to an effort that will be presented also this afternoon on trade by enterprise characteristics, which is basically with the same, let's say, basis as we have developed trade by enterprise characteristics, and also the next evolution that at least we are pushing forward in Europe for services trade by enterprise characteristic. We have we have some minutes still left for questions or remarks from the floor. So, is there anyone who would like to intervene? So, Nadine, and also Gary later.
It's more of a remark rather than a question, and the remark really is congratulations. This is a fantastic piece of work, and it, as I mentioned yesterday, it's a piece of work that we want to try to disseminate as widely as possible to encourage as many countries as possible to do this, and we'll be having a more detailed discussion tomorrow afternoon. One of the highlights, I guess, that everyone should take away from the work is how you can get really good results sometimes by focusing only on a handful of firms. And you know, the data that you showed suggested that if you look at just the top 100 firms, you're covering 50% of the story. So when we talk, for example, about imposing burdens, there are ways around in which we can think about how we can provide this data in a way that is perhaps not overly burdensome for NSOs. So that's what I wanted to say, because like I said, tomorrow we'll have a longer opportunity to discuss. But again, congratulations. I think it's great work.
Thank you. Now, Professor Griffin.
That's okay. Also, I would echo Nadim's comment that it's an excellent presentation, very rich. Just a quick question for each. For Gerardo on the micro side, where you said you now have data by the 32 states, and it's one of the big questions is backward and forward linkages in Mexico by these firms. And I agree that if you can have the big firms focus on them, we'll learn a lot. Is it easy to find that information about backward and forward linkages by firm? Are the firm data linked for production, employment, and exports? Do we know at the same firm level who's doing what? And I think it's great to know this by state, but do you also have the establishment level data by zip code? So you could actually say the city and state, if it's Monterrey and Nuevo León, diferente de otra ciudad. So just knowing how easily it is to track the backward-forward linkages, that would be one question. And a final part there, the intra-maquila trade. In Baja California, for example, a lot of the maquilas trade with each other. And so can you track that better now with your data set than you could before? And so something with Francisco also, if we were looking at the auto industry and the aerospace industries, some key suppliers are going to supply both. And some are going to supply autos, but not electronics. So for example, engine suppliers or electronic suppliers. And I think that'd be one of the really interesting questions when we look across these value chains. Which suppliers have key parts that are going into related industries? And if we could, so I would think there's one category of firms that'll supply both, one that would just be auto suppliers, one that would be aerospace. But it would also be really good if we could know for those firms employment and wage information. So does the aerospace industry pay higher than the auto industry, or autos in some supply chains? Some of the auto supply chains might pay more than others, could vary by region of the country. So many variations. I'm just wondering whether the data would allow us to distinguish those kind of supplier linkages by wages and employment.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. The estimation we make using these enterprises we formed, the base for this information is in our economic census from 2009. This is information for 2008. Right now, we are conducting our 2014 economic census with reference to the year 2013. What we have is a group of establishment, in other words, a basic observation unit called establishment. In the case of manufacturing, these are understood as industrial plants. In this case, when we sought to make equitable the observation unit that we have in our measurement of the manufacturing surveys in our census with what we have in our foreign trade records, we need to set up and form this establishment. Behind it, we're going to see many industrial plants, but each one of these establishments has its own NAICS code. It's classified for every one of the industries that it belongs to, considering the criterion provided by international recommendations under the main or core activity focus. In this case, what revenue or income are generated by the main activity. Now, when we form this enterprise or establishment, we consider this focus, and that will be the prevailing activity in order to assign the company a NAICS code. So let's look at this under two dimensions: the consolidated establishment and the enterprise, and the establishment that where we have detected the industrial plant by the survey and the economic census. So yes, we can go all the way to the detail behind the enterprise. Why? Because we have the information by establishment that gave rise to the data by company. Now, we are not making a distinction. We don't have a specific segregation between maquilas or of maquilas. In this case, we should say no longer as maquilas, but rather in the international jargon of manufacturing services, the input property of the manufacturing services owned by the owners. Under this focus, we have all our manufacturing, but it would be feasible to analyze or do specific tracking of the maquilas, of course, knowing already that states such as Baja California or Chihuahua or municipalities like Juarez on the border with the United States mentioned by Gary are relevant because there is a very high presence of maquila companies that provide manufacturing services. So yes, we could make a segregation. We haven't done so because of the discussion, ongoing discussion around the world, even within the country itself, regarding the measurement we're making in gross terms of international trade flows within the Mexican national account systems and also within the trade balance, payment balance of our country. So without a doubt, this is what we have available, and behind it are establishments. And these establishments allowed us to make a distinction and to understand where the export production is coming from. On the other hand, well, very briefly, because I think our time is up, there's a relationship in the industry with respect to other industries. That was one of the objectives of working with our information in terms of boxes of use and origin. And we took this to the IO tables that allowed us to identify, if not a specific chain, what the different dependencies that might exist in the sector with respect to imported and national inputs. We set up an import matrix by type of good. In other words, we were able to observe, according to the NAICS classification, what kind of imported goods were being used in a given activity or other activities. I'm talking about aerospace in this case, but other activities, and what relationship or what link might exist in terms of dependencies on other inputs of national origin. Hence the importance of these matters. Now, looking at these things as a cluster is something else. We can see this under the lens of the IO table or others. Now, I would like to complement with the notion that in Mexico we set out to clearly study the harmonized system by observing each one of the customs fractions, and a standard was created. The full name in Spanish is it's a standard that links the harmonized system, HR, with the North American industrial classification system. So now we are mandated to conduct this detailed analysis to determine what kind of imported or national inputs and look at the exports with the industrial classification of North America. The other step would be to think about another framework, but these associated elements associated to the industries are what allowed us to reach an important level of detail. Thank you.
So one very final question from France. Thank you. Very brief, please. Very briefly.
Lo siento, me voy a hacerlo en inglés porque los términos técnicos no lo conozco en español. I got two quick questions. One from Gerardo. It's about the localization. Because for maquiladores, I think there is no such a problem. But we tried to do it in France, and each time, each enterprise will attribute its export to the headquarters. So the must place for export in France is Roissy Charles de Gaulle. Okay? Even if the plant is in another place. So you have to, you can correct it by using the people and localized in plants, etc. But there is that difficulty, which is not natural. And also, the fact that inside enterprise groups, you can have one company who declare export, the other one who declare import, even if the production is in the third one. So, for the localization, you have to be cautious. The other point is a question more oriented to Francisco, but maybe also to Gerardo. Because as I've seen, there is surplus for manufacturing products. But for example, for automotive industry, do you have the possibility to know the complement for services, patterns, royalties, etc., for this specific industry? And what does it could change for the industrial surplus? Maybe reverse it or not. I don't know, but maybe it could be very stimulating for people and deciders to understand the link.
Thank you. So maybe we take another question, final one, unless you can ask. No, okay. Very final question, and then you may answer. Thank you.
Yo estoy de acuerdo que
I do agree that your work has been excellent. Some of us have tried to conduct these estimations, and it has been very difficult to do so. In particular, I think that the data you're showing are still of more concern, of greater concern than what some of us had anticipated. So under this context, I have two questions. One, in terms of added value, do you have data, or are you going to work on this, on what is that we are adding as value in this 20% of added value? And the other consideration or question is, it has been said that the important thing about doing these things is how we are going, will help us talk to authorities. So my question under this slide is what INEGI is going to tell authorities with these data. I would expect something like, stop opening the country up. Thank you. Thank you. Regarding what the estimation of exports by state means, I was saying this estimation is a byproduct of having linked the information of our customs registers, where we have data by company, with data from establishments that we set up, coming with information that come from the manufacturing surveys that we conduct every year, and the economic census from 2009. The information we have in the census and the surveys is by establishment, and we're going to investigate these companies with this survey with questions that I would say are determinate or for this investigation, because we asked, in this case, we asked the establishment. A moment ago, Gary was saying, let's think Monterey, or if it's in Baja California. Well, ask if this establishment as such has export sales. So this allows us to identify where the export production lies. The same questions that we have in our economic census. In particular, for those larger companies, we have a very particular operation for those companies, our enterprises that provide the greatest share to export and imports in our country. So I would say that these are screening questions to identify which plant, which specific economic unit is exporting. So in our estimation of exports by state, behind this we have an underlying location of the production that is being exported, that we capture through these questions that we do in our economic service census and our manufacturing surveys. And the rest of the work comes through the links with customs information to identify countries of origin and destination and the amount. That's basically what we do. Okay, very briefly, to answer to the question of from our colleague in France. When we make an observation by an establishment kind of unit, the decision over the royalties, the brands, and so on will be at a company level or enterprise level. Indeed, at the establishment level, we have the operational surplus or the gross operation surplus that includes all these elements. Where we can see this from the other side, from the other perspective, in institutional sectors called enterprises. And here is where we can determine certain elements, such as royalties and so on, that have been reflected, but we have been unable to distribute by establishment because the decisions are made on a company-wide level and not at the establishment. We have the matrix, as in any national account system, to look at the constitution of a company or in terms of the number of establishments it includes. And at the level of a specific transaction, I think that would be a challenge to see what happens in each case. And yes, indeed, there is an operational surplus that implicitly explains all these elements. Now, regarding, I'm glad the data are being used. I thank you for your comment. I'm very happy that our work might produce these kinds of judgments. Some might say it's good or bad. Our mandate is to provide our institutions the information they require for decision-making or to our academicians for their investigations and studies and so on. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. Y ahora sí, vamos a proceder a cerrar la sesión de esta mañana, porque vamos con un poco de retraso. So I would like to thank you again, all the participants, all the presenters, also Ronald, which is there, and thank you all the colleagues in the meeting room for their useful and lively contributions. So we have some delay on the agenda, but I think we can resume at 2:30. It will be Hubert making the chairmanship this afternoon, but I will be also in this table because I have a presentation to be made. So we see each other again at 2:30 here. Thank you.